Date, October 13th, 2016. Location, Central City. The cafeteria was alive with the usual chaos, an echo chamber of clinking utensils, half-hearted laughter, gossip, and the constant hum of industrial machines rumbling beyond the walls. But in the far corner of the room, 14-year-old Jaden Carter sat alone, his scuffed lunchbox on the table, trying to stretch a small sandwich and a bruised apple into enough fuel to carry him through the rest of the long day. He was the youngest person in the entire building, his slight frame and tired eyes already seasoned by a life too heavy for a child to carry, his skin dark and smooth, his hands rough from handling factory equipment not meant for someone his age. Jaden had learned to blend into the background, to survive quietly, one shift at a time, ever since his father had abandoned them when he was barely old enough to understand what the word gone meant. His mother, Aaliyah, only 28, worked double shifts at a downtown Atlanta cafe just to keep the lights on and pay for his little sister Imani's asthma medication, while Jaden, instead of being in school like other kids his age, worked here in the cold underbelly of industry just to make sure there was food at home. He never expected kindness here. He never expected to matter, but that changed in a single moment. Across the room, moving slowly through the narrow aisle between the tables, was an older white woman in a faded yellow uniform, one Jaden didn't recognize. She walked with stiff legs and a glassy stare, her skin pale and glistening with sweat, and something about her didn't look right. He noticed her first because no one else did, or maybe they just didn't care. And then suddenly, her knees buckled beneath her. Her tray slipped from her fingers and crashed to the floor with a sharp metallic clang, food scattering across the concrete as she collapsed beside a row of workers who flinched but didn't rise. Her body hit the ground hard, her arms limp, her breath shallow. Jaden leapt from his chair, his heart slamming against his chest as the noise around them faltered and dissolved into stillness. People stared, some whispered, but none of them moved. "Someone help!" Jaden shouted, kneeling beside the woman whose eyelids fluttered like fragile wings. Her mouth opened slightly, her words barely audible. "Sugar. I need sugar." She was diabetic and going into shock. Jaden didn't hesitate. He turned, ran back to his table, yanked open his old lunchbox, and brought over everything he had. He knelt again and gently lifted her head, cradling it in his lap as he broke his peanut butter sandwich into small pieces, feeding them to her carefully while his hands trembled. He opened his granola bar, peeled an orange, anything with sugar, anything that might bring her back. Her cold fingers brushed his wrist as she chewed weakly, her breaths gradually growing deeper. Still, no one helped. Jaden looked up, furious and confused, but all he saw were blank stares and empty faces. And then, after endless minutes, her eyes slowly opened. Not wide, but enough. Her pupils settled on his face, as if trying to recognize the boy who had ignored fear and done what grown adults wouldn't. You saved me," she whispered, her voice raw and grateful. Jaden blinked, unsure what to say, unsure what he'd done beyond follow instinct, beyond treat someone like a human being. The woman reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Around them, workers resumed their chatter, pretending they hadn't just watched an old woman nearly die on the factory floor. But this woman, this pale, frail, unknown woman in the yellow uniform, locked her eyes onto Jaden's. And though he didn't know it yet, this moment would ripple through both of their lives like a stone tossed into still water. Because this woman wasn't just another employee. She was Eleanor Whitmore, the hidden owner of the factory, and the kindness Jaden had shown her, without knowing who she was, without asking anything in return, would become the first spark in a chain of events that would rewrite the destiny of his family, his workplace, and himself. Sure, to like this video, subscribe for more real stories and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. The next morning, the factory air felt different, thicker somehow, like tension and curiosity had soaked into the very walls overnight. And though no one said it out loud, everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Jaden walked in through the side gate with his backpack slung over one shoulder, his steps heavier than usual, partly from exhaustion, but mostly from the unease brewing inside him. He hadn't told his mother about the woman who collapsed. He didn't want to worry her or give her one more thing to carry on top of rent, bills, and Imani's health. But he hadn't been able to stop thinking about it either. He kept replaying the way she had looked at him, her words, "You saved me," looping in his mind like a soft whisper that wouldn't fade. He thought maybe she hadn't even survived the night, that maybe the sugar and the sandwich and the granola bar weren't enough. But when he entered the dim-lit factory floor and made his way past the buzzing machines and hunched-over workers, he saw her, Eleanor. She wasn't wearing the yellow uniform today. No, today she wore something different. A gray factory jacket, still nondescript but slightly better pressed, a touch of authority in how it fit her thin frame. She stood near the maintenance station with her arms crossed, not working, just watching, observing. Her pale face was calm, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room slowly like a lens focusing in. Jaden froze when their eyes met across the space. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, but she gave him a single nod, slow and deliberate, like a chess player making the first move of a hidden game. Jaden's stomach tightened. She remembered him. She knew exactly who he was. But what did that mean? Nobody around him seemed to recognize her or care. Just another older white woman doing light-duty work, maybe. But to Jaden, her presence now glowed like a quiet fire. Something was happening behind the scenes. His shift passed with strange energy, the factory's rhythm offbeat, co-workers whispering more than usual, supervisors looking over shoulders they usually ignored. A few glanced at Jaden as if wondering what he had done to earn this woman's silent attention. He tried to stay focused, tightening bolts, stacking components, keeping his head down like always. But every time he looked up, she was nearby. Always at a distance, always watching. Not just him, but everything. At lunch, she didn't sit alone like before. She didn't sit at all. She stood quietly by the vending machines, sipping a cup of tea, her eyes flicking from table to table, like she was taking inventory of souls, not snacks. Jaden ate quietly in his corner again, but this time he wasn't alone. Not really. He felt her gaze even when he didn't see it, and what bothered him most wasn't fear. It was not knowing who she really was, not knowing if he had done something wrong or something right, not knowing why someone who should have been invisible yesterday now radiated silent power. But he sensed it in his gut. The ground beneath him had shifted, and though he didn't understand it yet, Jaden Carter had just stepped into a world that saw him, not just as a kid in overalls, but as a spark. And somewhere deep in the shadows of the factory's upper offices, people had begun to take notice. By the third day, the whispers had grown louder, curling around the steel beams of the factory like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. And Jaden could feel the weight of eyes pressing against his back no matter where he moved. Eyes that didn't belong to Eleanor this time, but to the other workers. Older white men who had never spoken a word to him before, now suddenly too aware of his every motion. The cafeteria incident had rippled beneath the surface of the factory's carefully controlled silence. And though no one said her name, everyone had noticed the quiet woman in gray, who was now strolling through the halls like she owned the place. Because unbeknownst to them, she did. Jaden tried to ignore it to keep his focus on his tasks. But even the machines seemed to hum with suspicion now. At his station, the temperature felt hotter, the air thicker, and the usual rhythm of his hands, the only thing that ever brought him peace, had turned clumsy. He reached for a tool only to find it missing, placed in the wrong bin, screws unsorted, settings tampered with. The hydraulic press made a strange grinding sound when he powered it on. Something was off. He paused, checked everything twice, then 3 times like his mom always told him to. And still the machine sputtered like it was choking on something unseen. A supervisor walked by, glanced down at the clipboard, and gave Jaden a lingering look. Nothing hostile, but not friendly either, just waiting. Jaden's heartbeat quickened. He hadn't done anything wrong, but in this place, being black, being young, and being noticed was sometimes all it took to be guilty. By the end of the shift, the press had shut down completely, locking up mid-cycle with a loud metallic screech that drew heads from 3 workstations away. Alarms didn't blare, but the message was clear. Production had stopped. Jaden stood frozen, his gloved hands hovering over the control panel, his chest rising and falling as a red warning light blinked like an accusation. "What did you do?" a voice behind him hissed. One of the floor workers, broad-shouldered and red-faced, arms crossed as if already certain Jaden had done it on purpose. The supervisor arrived in seconds, flanked by two clipboard-carrying managers with furrowed brows. Jaden explained quickly, clearly, exactly what he had done, but they didn't write it down. They just nodded, silent and skeptical. A maintenance technician arrived, slid under the machine, and after 10 minutes of tinkering, stood up and shrugged. "Something got lodged in the release valve," he muttered. "Might have been deliberate or just bad luck." The word deliberate rang in Jaden's ears like a dropped wrench. He looked around. No one stepped forward. No one offered support. He was alone again, but this time not invisible. This time he was a threat. On his walk home, the factory behind him humming into dusk, Jaden replayed every moment, every movement, every face. He knew he hadn't caused the malfunction. He also knew someone else might have. Someone who didn't like the way Eleanor Whitmore had been watching him. Someone who wanted to remind him that this place had rules. And boys like him weren't supposed to break the silence. That night at home, as his mother rubbed her aching feet and Imani read a worn picture book by candlelight during a power outage they couldn't afford to fix, Jaden sat quietly, saying nothing about the machine. He didn't want to add to his mother's stress, but inside a fire was building. Of fear, yes, but also defiance. Someone had tried to sabotage him. Maybe not just the machine, but him. And whoever it was, they weren't ready for what would happen next. Because Eleanor Whitmore hadn't stopped watching, and Jaden Carter had no idea that he was being tested, not for failure, but for greatness. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. The next morning arrived like a weight dropped from the sky, gray and sluggish, with clouds pressing low over the Atlanta skyline, as if mirroring the pressure building inside Jaden's chest. He hadn't slept, not really. Every creak in the night had sounded like machinery, every whisper of wind like voices accusing him of something he didn't do. Still, he dragged himself out of bed, kissed his mother's cheek while she pretended not to wince from the soreness in her bones, and walked Imani to the corner where she waited to be picked up by a neighbor who homeschooled 3 kids in their apartment building. Then, as usual, he made the long walk to the factory, weaving through the alleys and underpasses of a city that had never been kind to families like his head down, his hands jammed in his jacket pockets. Inside the factory gates, the energy was tighter, almost electric. People moved faster, spoke less, watched more. The moment he stepped through the time clock turnstile, he noticed it. Eyes. Supervisors, workers, floor managers. Everyone seemed to look at him just a second too long. He clenched his jaw, refusing to let the unease show. He moved to his station, preparing to resume the task he knew better than his own heartbeat. But before he could lift a tool, a voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Jaden Carter, report to the main office, immediately." Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Even the machine seemed to pause for a beat. Jaden froze, his breath catching as adrenaline shot through his veins. No one got called to the main office. Not kids, not floor workers. That was the domain of top management, HR, corporate meetings. The distant world above the factory floor, where people like him didn't belong. As he made his way through the long hallway lined with gray lockers and faded posters about safety and productivity, he felt every step echo like judgment. Workers leaned aside, some with curiosity, others with silent glee, as if sensing drama about to unfold. When he reached the main office door, a tall steel thing with frosted glass, he paused, wiped his palms against his pants, and knocked. A firm voice from inside replied, "Come in." He pushed the door open and entered a world that smelled of polished wood and expensive coffee. A world too clean, too quiet. A white male supervisor stood by the window, arms folded, expression unreadable. Behind the desk, seated like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, was Eleanor Whitmore, but not the quiet, pale woman in a yellow uniform from the cafeteria. Today, she wore a deep navy blue suit that looked tailored to royalty, her silver hair swept into a bun, a pearl pin on her collar, and eyes sharper than any blade in the building. She didn't smile. She didn't stand. She just looked at him, measured him, and gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jaden obeyed, heart pounding in his ears. The silence stretched between them until it felt unbearable. Finally, Eleanor leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "Do you know who I am, Jaden?" He shook his head slowly, afraid to guess. She smiled faintly, almost sadly. "I own this factory," she said, "and 10 others like it." The words dropped like a hammer, heavy and final. Jaden's mouth parted, but no sound came. The woman he had fed with trembling hands, who had collapsed like a stranger in front of him, she wasn't just another worker. She was the boss, the top, the reason the whole place existed. "I went undercover," she continued, "because I wanted to see how people are treated when no one's watching. I wanted to know what my company really is. Not on paper, not in reports, but down here on the floor, where it matters." Her gaze didn't waver. "And you, Jaden, you saved me. You gave me food. You stayed with me. You didn't know who I was. You had nothing to gain, but you acted with kindness anyway." Jaden sat frozen, his mind racing, his throat dry. He didn't know what to say. Was this a trick? A test? A setup? The supervisor at the window still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "But I've also seen what's happened since then. The sabotage, the stares, the pressure. And I want you to know, I see it. I see you." Her words cracked something in him. He hadn't cried in years, but his chest tightened as emotion welled up from a place he had buried long ago. "You don't deserve to be treated like a threat," she added gently. "You deserve opportunity. You deserve support. You and your family." Jaden blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Why me?" Eleanor smiled now, truly smiled, like someone proud of what they'd found. "Because you remind me of who I used to be, and because people like you change the world." And in that small, still room, high above the noise of the machines and the weight of the factory's history, Jaden Carter's life began to shift, not by luck, not by accident, but by the power of character, courage, and compassion. The room felt impossibly still, like time itself had stepped aside to let this moment breathe. And as Jaden sat there in the chair, his thin fingers clenched into the worn fabric of his jeans, his breath held tight in his chest, he could hardly believe what was happening. A week ago, he was just another shadow on the factory floor, a 14-year-old black kid nobody saw, scraping through each day so his mom and little sister could eat, could survive. Now he was face to face with Eleanor Whitmore, one of the most powerful women in Georgia's industrial sector, and she was speaking to him like he mattered, like he wasn't invisible, like she had seen past his age, his poverty, his skin, and into something that no one else had ever bothered to look for, his heart. She stood now slowly, with grace that came from a life of wealth and control, walked to the large window behind her desk, and looked down at the factory floor below. The machines churning, the workers moving like pieces in a great machine. "You know what they see down there, Jaden?" she said, her voice soft but edged with steel. "They see labor. They see numbers, quotas, bodies, but not people, not souls, not stories." She turned back to him, her pale face lit by morning light, eyes alive with something fierce. "I've been in boardrooms where men talk about workers like tools, replaceable, silent, cheap. But you reminded me that this place, this empire, is built on backs like yours, your mother's, your futures, and that means something." Jaden felt a swell of heat in his chest, not just emotion, but something deeper, like dignity waking up inside him after years of sleep. He'd never had anyone in power speak his name like it held value. Eleanor moved toward her desk again and pulled open a sleek leather folder, laying it in front of him. Inside were papers, crisp and official, But what caught his eye wasn't the ink or the seal, it was what she said next. "I want to enroll you in school, Jaden. A real school, private, fully paid for. Uniforms, supplies, tutoring, whatever you need. And your sister too. She deserves a future, not just dreams." Jaden's eyes widened, his mind staggering under the weight of what she was offering. "And your mother," Eleanor added with a small, knowing smile. "She's the kind of woman who keeps the world together when it's falling apart. I'd like to offer her a supervisory role here. Flexible hours, full benefits, a salary she's never dared to imagine. She belongs in leadership, not behind a diner counter wiping down tables for people who don't tip." Jaden stared at her, overwhelmed, a war raging between disbelief and hope in his chest. "Why?" he asked again, voice cracking. "Why would you do this for us?" Eleanor paused. Her eyes softened. "Because you didn't owe me anything, but you gave anyway. You saw a stranger in pain and didn't hesitate. That kind of integrity can't be taught in school, Jaden. It lives in you. And when I think about the kind of world I want to leave behind, I want it to be built by people like you." For a moment, silence fell between them again. But it wasn't cold this time. It was warm, sacred, filled with the sound of possibility. Jaden lowered his eyes to the folder, then to his calloused hands, and then back to her face. "Can I think about it?" he asked, uncertain, overwhelmed. Eleanor nodded. "Of course, but I hope you say yes. Not for me, for them." She nodded toward the hallway, toward his mother and sister, toward the life that could be waiting just beyond the threshold of this moment. And as Jaden stood up, his legs shaky, heart pounding, the world outside the office looked the same. Machines, sweat, concrete, rust. But inside him, everything had changed. He hadn't been chosen by chance. He had been chosen by choice. Because when no one else had cared, he had. And now life was giving him a chance to rise. Not by running away from who he was, but by stepping fully into it. Jaden walked out of the office in a daze, his footsteps slow and uncertain, as if the hallway beneath him might collapse at any second. And as the heavy door clicked shut behind him, it felt like the rest of the factory had resumed breathing after holding its breath. Workers glanced up as he passed, some with curiosity, others with guarded suspicion. But Jaden didn't look at any of them. His mind was flooded, overflowing with what he'd just heard, what he'd just been offered. A school, real school, a future, a job for his mother that didn't leave her knees swollen and her spirit drained. An open hand, offered not with pity, but with something more rare, respect. But even as those hopes flared to life inside him, doubt rode in on their heels like a shadow. What if this was a trick? What if it was temporary? What if she changed her mind, or someone convinced her he wasn't worth it? He didn't want to get his family's hopes up only to watch them shatter. As he stepped out of the building into the pale afternoon light, the air hit his face like cold water, reminding him he was still in Atlanta, still in the same neighborhood where broken promises littered the sidewalks like crushed soda cans. He walked the long route home, the folder tucked tightly under his arm, eyes darting over every corner, like the streets themselves might try to steal this chance away. When he finally reached the apartment complex, its bricks chipped, its railings rusted, he climbed the stairs two at a time and burst into their small two-bedroom unit, where the smell of overcooked rice filled the air, and Imani's laughter spilled from the floor as she played with crayons on a blanket. Aaliyah looked up from the sink, her face immediately worried. "Jaden?" she asked, setting down the dish. "What happened?" For a moment, he said nothing, just handed her the folder, unable to find the words. She opened it slowly, her tired eyes scanning the pages, and then narrowing in disbelief. "Is this real?" she whispered. "It's real," Jaden said, voice shaking. "It's all real. The woman I helped, she's the owner. She wants to help us. All of us." Aaliyah sat down at the small kitchen table like her legs had given out, one hand over her mouth, the other resting on the paper like it might vanish if she let go. "She offered you school?" she asked. "Imani too?" Jaden nodded. "And you, a job. Not just any job, a supervisor position. Good pay, benefits. A future, tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away with the practiced strength of a woman who hadn't had the luxury of crying for years. Why would she do this, she asked, more to the room than to him. Because, Jaden said quietly, I fed her. When she collapsed, I helped her. That's it. I didn't know who she was. I just did what felt right. Aaliyah looked at her son, truly looked at him, as if seeing not just the boy she had raised, but the man he was becoming. You didn't just help her, she whispered. You reminded her what humanity looks like. Amani looked up from her crayons, sensing the shift in the air, and crawled into her mother's lap. Are we going to school, Mama? She asked. Aaliyah held her tight. We just might, baby. We just might. That night they didn't eat much, just leftovers, but it felt like a feast. They sat together at the tiny table, talking about possibilities instead of problems, about dreams instead of deadlines. Jaden still wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he saw a horizon that wasn't dark. He wasn't sure he trusted the world, but something about Eleanor's voice, the way she looked at him, told him this wasn't a setup. It was a test, and he had passed. And as he lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling with his sister asleep beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the electric pulse of a life beginning, not ending. He was ready to say yes, not just to Eleanor, but to hope. And in the quiet dark, he whispered to the room, to God, to himself, we're going to make it. Jaden awoke before the sun the next morning, but this time, it wasn't dread that stirred him from sleep. It was purpose, humming in his chest like the rhythm of something ancient and unstoppable. The world outside their apartment was still rough and gray, the stairwell still rusted, the neighbors still dragging their tired bodies to underpaid jobs. But inside their home, something had changed. The folder from Eleanor now lay on the table like a crown, its papers neatly signed, its promise fully accepted. Aaliyah had spent the night reading every line, calling the number listed, confirming the offer was real, that it wasn't a cruel joke played on a tired woman and her children. And when the confirmation came, she cried, quietly in the bathroom, with the water running, then emerged with her chin lifted higher than Jaden had ever seen. That day, everything moved like a dream running ahead of them, just barely within reach. By the end of the week, Aaliyah had left the cafe where she'd spent years bending to customers who snapped their fingers for coffee and stepped into a new uniform. This one with a name badge that said Team Supervisor and a shift schedule that finally let her be home for dinner. Jaden and Amani were both enrolled in a small private school across town, one that smelled like fresh books and opportunity, where the teachers actually learned your name and asked about your dreams. Jaden felt strange walking into a classroom again after so long. It was like stepping into a world he thought had locked its doors behind him. But he found himself sitting up straighter, answering questions, even making a few friends who didn't look at his shoes or laugh at his thrift store backpack. Imani took to school like a bird discovering its wings, her bright eyes lit up at the sight of new crayons, clean desks, and a playground without broken swings. At the factory, word spread fast, first in whispers, then in sidelong glances. That's the boy who was called to the office. That's his mom. She got promoted overnight. Something's going on. And beneath those words, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, were others. They're black. They're not supposed to move up like that. Jaden felt it before he heard it, the shift in the air when he entered the building, the half smiles that didn't reach eyes, the silence that followed him down hallways. Some workers nodded politely, others turned away. One man, tall, pale, with hands like hammers, muttered under his breath as Jaden passed. Favoritism. Jaden didn't respond. He held his head up, but his stomach twisted. He hadn't asked for the spotlight. He hadn't begged for charity. All he had done was care. And now people who'd never looked at him twice were suddenly uncomfortable with his presence. Aaliyah, too, noticed the shift. Some of the white supervisors called her ma'am through tight teeth, praised her efficiency in meetings, but skipped her in group discussions. Yet she moved with quiet pride, proving her worth not with words but with results, earning respect step by steady step. At home, they tried not to talk about the stares, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. But it hung in the air like Georgia heat, sticky, heavy, inescapable. Still, Jaden refused to bend. He showed up early, stayed late, worked hard, studied harder, and every time doubt crept in, every time fear wrapped its cold fingers around his neck, he remembered the moment Eleanor looked him in the eye and said, "You remind me of who I used to be." That memory became his armor, because even though the road was lined with resistance, Jaden had already begun to rise. Not as a fluke, not by accident, but as a flame that refused to go out, and no amount of shadows could stop what had already been set in motion. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. The factory, once just a place of mechanical repetition and industrial noise, had become something else now. Something quieter but more dangerous, like a pot simmering just below the boil. Steam rising through invisible cracks. Jaden could feel it in the walls, in the way conversations paused when he entered a room, in the forced politeness of greetings from supervisors who never spoke his name before. His footsteps echoed louder than anyone else's. Every movement, every word, every pause was watched, weighed, and quietly judged. The moment Eleanor had opened the gates to opportunity, the air around him thickened with unspoken resentment, and though no one dared speak it out loud, Jaden knew what they were thinking. He didn't earn it. He's just a kid. He's just lucky. He's just black. The word never reached his ears, but he heard it anyway, in the way it slipped beneath side eyes and muttered chuckles, in the way clipboards were checked more carefully when he was around, in the way old workers spoke just loud enough for him to hear pieces of sentences that weren't meant for him. Fast-tracked, must be nice. Some people get handed everything, just trying to make us look bad. Jaden didn't react, not once. He kept his posture straight, his chin steady, his hands busy. He didn't argue, didn't snap, didn't defend himself. Instead, he focused on what he could control: his work, his words, his pace. He moved like a ghost who refused to disappear, like a whisper too solid to ignore. But the tension bled into other parts of the factory too. Eleanor's quiet presence still lingered, though she had returned to her office suites, overseeing operations from a different floor now. Her name carried weight among the managers, and Jaden suspected she was still watching, still listening, even if from behind glass. A few workers, mostly younger ones, had started to gravitate toward Jaden, asking him about his school, about his family, about whether Eleanor really talked to him. But those conversations happened in hushed tones, in back corners, always away from the older crowd who didn't take kindly to the new order forming. One afternoon, he found a screw deliberately loosened on a piece of machinery he was inspecting, just enough to cause a malfunction if someone hadn't caught it in time. He fixed it silently, logged it without a word, and moved on. Another day, someone spilled coffee on the locker room bench where his uniform usually sat, soaking it through. Jaden didn't flinch. He brought an extra from home the next day and kept working. His silence unnerved them. His refusal to sink to their level made them restless. But Jaden knew something they didn't. Storms can't drown you if you learn how to breathe underwater. At home, he didn't tell Aaliyah or Imani about the sabotage. He knew his mother would march straight into the factory and speak fire into the walls, and he couldn't afford to let her lose what she had just begun to rebuild. Instead, he focused on his studies at night and whispered encouragement to Imani when her schoolwork made her cry. And in the quiet moments before sleep, he would stare at the ceiling, fists curled on his chest, and remind himself that rising wasn't supposed to be easy. It was supposed to hurt, because change, real change, never comes without resistance. And Jaden Carter was change walking in steel-toe boots, unbent, unbroken, and unforgiving, to the hate that circled around him like wolves around a lion. They didn't know it yet, but Jaden wasn't just surviving this place. He was transforming it, one silent act of strength at a time. Respect didn't come like applause or a spotlight. It came like the gradual light of dawn, so slow and subtle that at first no one even noticed the darkness fading. But Jaden Carter felt it. One glance, one softened tone, one silent nod at a time. He had never asked for recognition, never demanded praise, but his silence had become a kind of language, and the factory, so used to noise, orders, and hierarchy, was starting to learn how to listen to it. It began in the smallest ways. A broken cartwheel he fixed without being asked, a newer worker he quietly guided through a task before a supervisor could bark it at them, a report he handed in not just complete, but neatly organized, with notes no one expected from a 14-year-old who wasn't even supposed to be there. One by one, workers who once scoffed at him started pausing when he spoke, if only for a second. The same men who had once whispered behind his back now stood beside him in line at lunch. Not quite friendly, but no longer hostile. One older mechanic, a man with sun-damaged skin and a permanent frown, muttered, "Kid knows what he's doing," after watching Jaden recalibrate a finicky conveyor sensor without needing to ask for help. Another time, Jaden found a misplaced inventory sheet no one else had noticed was missing, and instead of turning it in quietly, he brought it straight to the floor supervisor, calmly explaining how it could have delayed the entire day's shipment. The supervisor, white, stern, a man who had once referred to Jaden as the boy from the office, nodded stiffly and said, "Good catch." That was all, but it was everything. It was the beginning of a shift, not just in attitude but in presence. Jaden wasn't a problem. He wasn't a token. He was useful, reliable. And in a place like that, utility was power. Even the sabotage quieted. The coffee spills stopped. No more tools went missing. The threats and whispers began to die out, not because people had changed overnight, but because Jaden had refused to break. And something in that strength unnerved them more than any confrontation ever could. He became slowly the kind of person people came to for answers, even if they didn't admit it. A machine stalling, a count not adding up, a new worker unsure where to go. They came to him, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. And Jaden, though still just a kid on paper, moved through the factory like a man with purpose, with direction, with fire in his spine and his mother's grace in his blood. At home, things blossomed in tandem. Aaliyah came home smiling more often, her hair tied up in a clean wrap, her uniform ironed, her shoulders no longer sagging with the weight of disrespect. Imani's handwriting improved, and she read out loud with confidence now, no longer afraid of stumbling over words because her brother always reminded her, "We're not here to be perfect, we're here to be better." They cooked dinner together now, the three of them, laughing over burnt rice and spilled flour, because even mistakes felt lighter in a home no longer held together by fear. But at the factory, Jaden remained humble. He still clocked in early, still packed his modest lunch, still spoke softly unless speaking firmly was required. He didn't strut, he didn't gloat. He simply existed as proof that change doesn't always come with noise. It can arrive wearing steel boots in silence, moving one day at a time. And though few said it out loud, more and more of them began to see Jaden not just as a worker, not just as a child, but as something rarer, a leader born not from position or privilege, but from patience, integrity, and the quiet, unshakable refusal to become bitter in a place that expected him to break. It didn't happen with banners or announcements or grand speeches. It happened like roots growing beneath the concrete, quiet but relentless, as the spirit of transformation began to pulse through the factory's bones, carried by the unwavering presence of a 14-year-old boy who had refused to disappear. Jaden Carter had become something the factory didn't know it needed. A mirror, a question, a symbol of what things could look like if people remembered how to be human. His simple, consistent actions, showing up early, solving problems without being asked, offering quiet guidance to the newer hires who looked just as lost as he once did, had become a blueprint for others. Even the managers noticed. One afternoon, a floor supervisor pulled Jaden aside and asked, "If you had the chance to improve something here, what would it be?" The question stunned him, not because he didn't have answers, but because no one had ever asked. Jaden didn't waste the moment. He suggested a rotating break schedule to reduce burnout, an updated safety checklist written in plain language for newer workers, and a revised method for reporting small mechanical issues. Streamlined, anonymous, efficient. The supervisor, to Jaden's surprise, listened, actually listened. And within a week, those ideas, his ideas, were being tested in pilot form. Workers took notice. Productivity ticked up. Injuries dropped. Morale, though still guarded, began to lift like fog at sunrise. People started talking more, sharing tools without grumbling, even joking again over lunch. For the first time in years, the break room didn't feel like a holding cell. It felt like a place to breathe. Jaden walked through those aisles with more than just quiet strength now. He carried purpose, knowing his presence had started a ripple, a wave. And though he never boasted, people began to look to him not just for help, but for direction. They began to trust him, not because of his age or his title, but because he had never once tried to be anything but honest. Eleanor, though she remained mostly in the background now, watched the shift unfold like a proud architect whose blueprint was finally being built. She called Jaden into her office one day, not to give orders, but to ask for feedback. She told him the changes he'd inspired had not only improved the factory's output, but had caught the attention of other departments. She was considering expanding the ideas to her other facilities. "This started with one sandwich," she told him with a smile, "but you've turned it into a movement." Jaden didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't used to being credited, only blamed. But somewhere inside, he felt the truth settle warmly in his chest. He had done something. He had become something. At home, transformation mirrored the one happening at work. Aaliyah had begun helping other women in their building find jobs, giving resume tips, offering childcare swaps. Imani was reading chapter books now, drawing posters of her dream school, which she taped to the wall beside her bed. Jaden still studied hard, still worked late, still carried the weight of everything, but it no longer felt like he was dragging it alone. And the community noticed. A local church invited him to speak at a youth meeting. A neighborhood paper ran a short piece about the teen who helped change a factory. Jaden blushed when he read it, stuffed the article into his backpack, and never mentioned it to his classmates. He didn't need fame. He just needed momentum. Because now the goal wasn't survival, the goal was growth. And for the first time, the factory, the very place that had once tried to break him, had become the soil where something new could grow. He wasn't just enduring anymore. He was building. And behind him, brick by brick, a better world was starting to rise. Just as life had begun to settle into something close to peace, just as the pieces of Jaden's world were clicking into place, like a puzzle he'd spent his whole childhood trying to solve, the past came knocking, loud, unexpected, and wrapped in the very face he had learned to forget. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, golden sunlight warming the cracked sidewalk outside their apartment, Imani chalking rainbows onto the cement while Aaliyah simmered collard greens on the stove, and Jaden flipped through a worn textbook, trying to finish homework early. The knock was soft at first, almost cautious, and when Jaden opened the door, time seemed to pause. Standing there was a man he hadn't seen in nearly a decade, a man whose shadow had hung like smoke over every meal, every rent payment, every tear his mother had cried when she thought no one was looking. His father, Malcolm Carter, taller than Jaden remembered, with a faded denim jacket, aging eyes, and a voice like sandpaper. "Jay," the man said, voice trembling with something that might have been guilt. "You've grown up." Jaden didn't move, didn't blink. He stood in the doorway like a soldier guarding his peace, staring into the eyes of the man who had walked away when he was just 5 years old, who had vanished without a call, without a dollar, without a goodbye. Behind him, Imani peeked out from the side, squinting at the stranger with wide, uncertain eyes. "Who's that?" she whispered. "Nobody," Jaden said, still not moving, but the word didn't make the man flinch. Malcolm looked past his son into the apartment and then back again. "I heard what's been happening," he said. "The job, the school, what you did at that factory. I thought maybe it was time." Aaliyah appeared in the hallway, drying her hands with a towel, and when she saw him, she froze. Her eyes didn't widen. They didn't fill with tears. They just hardened, like stone, cooling under fire. "You've got nerve," she said flatly. "Years, no word, no help. And now that you smell stability, you come sniffing around?" Malcolm lowered his gaze. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted to see him, to say I'm sorry." Jaden's fist curled at his sides. Sorry. The word felt too small, too late. Where had this man been when they had gone nights without heat? When Imani had coughed through sickness with no medicine? When Aliyah had scraped grease off cafe floors for pennies while hiding her pain behind lipstick and a forced smile? Where was he when Jaden had worked in silence beside men who mocked him? When machines threatened to chew him up? When the world tried to crush his spirit and he stood up anyway? You don't get to say sorry and walk in here like we're a family, Jaden said, his voice low but steady, a steel edge in every syllable. You left. We built this without you. Malcolm looked like he wanted to speak again, but Aliyah stepped forward, standing beside her son, shoulders squared, voice cold as glass. You can leave now, and you can live with the knowledge that the son you abandoned didn't need you to become a man. For a long moment, Malcolm didn't move. He looked at Jaden, really looked at him, and maybe for the first time saw the strength he hadn't helped build, the backbone born not from blood, but from struggle, from sleepless nights and self-taught courage. Then he nodded, almost respectfully, and walked away without another word. The door clicked shut behind him like the closing of a chapter that never should have begun, and Jaden stood still, heart pounding, not from hurt, but from something stronger. Relief, release, power. Behind him, Imani reached for his hand. Aliyah placed her palm gently on his back, and in that quiet, heavy silence, Jaden realized something important. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means rising, even when the wounds still ache. His father's return hadn't broken them. It had reminded them of what they had already survived. And Jaden, for the first time, felt fully whole. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing had been able to stop him from becoming exactly who he was always meant to be. Months passed, and with each one, Jaden Carter grew, not just in height or knowledge, but in presence, in purpose, in the quiet kind of strength that doesn't ask for permission or praise. The factory that once chewed people up and spit them out had changed, not completely, not magically, but meaningfully, shift by shift, policy by policy, and heartbeat by heartbeat. Jaden had become more than a worker or a student or a son. He had become a symbol of what resilience looked like when it refused to stay silent. Eleanor Whitmore continued to oversee things from a distance, but her influence remained sharp and deliberate. With Jaden's help, she began to implement programs in her other facilities. Apprenticeships for underserved youth, health benefits for single parents, equity training for supervisors. And she called it the Carter Initiative without ever asking Jaden's permission. When he found out, he was stunned. You earned this, she told him with a smile. Your name should mean something to more than just a punch clock. At school, Jaden's teachers began calling him Mr. Carter, out of a blend of respect and gentle teasing, but the title fit. Imani's test scores soared, and she proudly told her classmates her brother was the reason their neighborhood got its first free tutoring center. Aliyah, now head of community relations at the factory, had become the face of what it meant to rise without stepping on others, hosting events, organizing drives, and mentoring women just like her who thought life had run out of second chances. The apartment they once struggled to afford had been replaced with a modest two-story home just outside the city, gifted by Eleanor but paid forward every day with hard work and gratitude. But Jaden never forgot where it started. One late afternoon, as the factory break room hummed with new energy, people laughing, sharing food, helping each other. Without being asked, Jaden walked in, his lunchbox tucked under one arm, his school books under the other. He glanced around the way he always did, scanning the tables, the faces. And then he saw him, a young boy, maybe 12, skinny and wide-eyed, sitting alone in the same corner Jaden once claimed like a shadow. His uniform looked too big for his frame, and his sandwich was barely more than a folded piece of bread. Jaden didn't hesitate. He walked over, sat down beside the kid, and without a word slid half of his lunch across the table. The boy looked at him, surprised, unsure. But Jaden smiled and said softly, I've been where you are. You won't be alone long. They sat in silence, sharing a meal while life moved around them. Nobody stopped to gawk, because by now kindness wasn't a spectacle in this place. It was a norm. And in that moment, Jaden realized he had become exactly what Eleanor once was to him, A spark, a bridge, a reason to believe. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but he had rewritten his story, not by waiting for someone to save him, but by answering a simple call when it came: to care, to act, to lead. The legacy he carried didn't wear a crown. It wore a name tag, worn boots, and a quiet smile that said, "We rise by lifting others." And in the rhythmic hum of the factory floor, in the laughter that echoed through the walls, in the future that now lived in his sister's eyes and the hopeful glance of a stranger, Jaden's story lived on, not as an ending, but as the beginning of 1,000 new ones.